My entitled mother demanded I hand over my house to her because my little sister is pregnant and needs it more than me. Originally posted to our entitled parents. Hi everyone. So I know some of you may have seen a version of this story floating around in another subreddit before it got removed. I'm reposting it here with a lot more detail this time because honestly, after everything that's happened, I feel like the full picture needs to be told. Fair warning, this is going to be a long one. Really long. I've got 2 months of built-up frustration and a whole lifetime of backstory to unpack. So get comfortable. Grab a snack, maybe 2, maybe a whole meal, possibly a beverage. I'll put a TLDR at the bottom for those of you who are short on time. But I genuinely think the details matter here because without them, it's easy to write my mother off as just your average run-of-the-mill entitled parent. She's not. She's a whole different level of something else entirely. A masterclass. Capital A. Thesis Defense in Narcissism. A TED Talk nobody asked for. Let me also say up front, there is more to this story than I've told before. I held some things back in earlier versions because I wasn't sure how to frame them, or because I was still processing them, or because the situation was still ongoing. It's not ongoing anymore, and now that it's done, I want the full record out there. Every detail, every moment, every piece of satisfying, documented, completely legal revenge I was able to extract from 2 women who absolutely had it coming. Settle in. Part 1. Background. Because you need it. Let me start from the beginning. Because my mother didn't just wake up one morning and decide to show up at my door and demand my house. This has been building for decades. And to really understand the kind of person she is, you need to know where all of this started. Not just the highlights, but the texture of it. The daily, grinding texture of growing up in a house where love was a reward dispensed for compliance and withheld as punishment. I'm 31 years old. I have 1 sibling, a sister who is 28. My parents divorced when I was around 14, 15 years old. The reason for the divorce, which my dad never tried to hide from me once I was old enough to understand it, was that my mother cheated on him with a guy she dated back in high school. Some old flame she reconnected with at a college reunion she technically wasn't supposed to attend because she told my dad she was visiting a sick friend out of state. A sick friend. She had receipts, fabricated doctor's appointment confirmations, everything. My mother, I would learn, plans things. She doesn't stumble into situations. She engineers them with the deliberate precision of someone who has been running cover stories her whole life and gotten good at it. My dad found out because my mother made a mistake she almost never makes. She underestimated someone. Specifically, she underestimated the person she'd asked to be her alibi. A friend who, when pressed by my dad, told the truth. Just flat out told him. Capital I. Found out later that my dad had already suspected something was off and had been quietly paying attention for weeks before he confronted the alibi. He was like that. Patient. Methodical. He didn't make moves until he was certain. When he confronted my mother, she didn't apologize. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She told him she deserved to be happy and that if he'd been a better husband she wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere. That was the whole explanation. She deserved to be happy. Full stop. End of discussion. This tells you everything you need to know about who she is. Encapsulated in 1 sentence spoken to a man she had just betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. My dad filed for divorce within the week. Now here's where the personality stuff starts to matter. My mother is, and has always been, deeply controlling, manipulative, and in the years since the divorce I've come to understand the word for what she is: narcissistic. Not in the casual, everyday way people throw that word around. I mean the real thing, the clinical shape of it, the kind of person who genuinely believes the world operates according to her rules, that other people exist to serve her needs, and that any inconvenience to her is a personal attack that deserves retaliation. She has never once in my memory apologized for anything and meant it. Every apology she's ever given has been transactional, currency exchanged for something she wanted, not an expression of actual remorse. Every gesture of kindness has had strings attached. Every single relationship she has is built on what that person can do for her, and the moment that utility runs out, so does her interest in them. She was, I want to say this carefully but accurately, not a good mother. She was an organized mother, in the sense that there was always food in the house and clothes got washed and school pickup happened on time. But the emotional architecture of the household was rotten. Everything was conditional. Love was rationed. Approval was a carrot on a stick that was always just slightly out of reach. And if you ever slowed down chasing it, she'd yank it higher. My sister, unfortunately, grew up as her mini-me. I don't entirely blame my sister for this, because she was raised in that environment full-time from a young age, and kids absorb what they're surrounded by. But by the time she was a teenager, she had fully adopted my mother's worldview. She believed she was owed things. She believed that rules and consequences applied to other people but not to her. She believed that her comfort was the organizing principle around which everyone else's life should arrange itself. And she believed, because our mother constantly reinforced it, that she was the special one, the one who deserved more, the one who needed to be protected and provided for. I, on the other hand, was the kid who was expected to contribute. And I don't mean contribute in the healthy, character-building sense where children learn responsibility through age-appropriate chores. I mean contribute in the sense that I was the household staff, while my sister sat in her room playing video games or talking on the phone with her friends all day. I was doing the dishes, the laundry, the vacuuming, the yard work, cooking dinner on nights my mother didn't feel like it, and running whatever errand she decided was urgent at the moment. I'm not exaggerating when I say I did the majority of the household labor for years while living in that house, and my mother would snap her fingers at me like I was a servant. Literally snap them, like you'd summon a dog. She'd be sitting on the couch watching television and she'd snap once, loudly, and point at whatever she wanted. The remote, a glass of water, a snack from the kitchen, a magazine from the other room, and I was just supposed to go get it. No, please, no thank you, no acknowledgement that I was a person, just the snap and the expectation of obedience. My sister thought this was hilarious. By the way, she would sometimes snap her fingers at me too, just to see what I'd do. I stopped responding to it when I was about 12, which caused a scene. And my mother's response to that scene was not to tell my sister to stop treating me like hired help but to tell me I was being dramatic. That's the household I grew up in. I also want to tell you about a specific incident because it captures something important. When I was about 13, I had saved up money from doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, lawn mowing, washing cars, that kind of thing. This was before the divorce, before everything fell apart. I had saved about $60 in cash in a shoebox in my closet, and I was saving toward a specific video game I wanted. I had been working toward that goal for weeks. One day the money was gone. Every dollar. I knew immediately it was my sister because she was the only other person who went in my room. When I confronted her, she shrugged and told me she'd needed it. Needed it for what? She wouldn't specify. When I went to my mother and told her what happened, expecting, what? Justice? Basic fairness. My mother told me that I needed to learn to be more generous with family, that my sister was younger and I should look out for her. She did not make my sister return the money. She did not punish her. She told me to be more generous and walked away. I started hiding my money after that, in increasingly elaborate ways. I'm still a little proud of some of those hiding spots. After my parents split, the choice of where to live was, in my case, not even a question. I went to live with my dad full-time as soon as it was legally possible. My sister stayed with our mother, which surprised absolutely no one. The two of them had always been thick as thieves, and frankly, I think my sister preferred the environment where she was the golden child and I was the help. With me gone, she got all of my mother's attention and none of the expectations. My dad was a different kind of person entirely. He was calm, disciplined, hardworking, and he had a really clear sense of what he valued and why. He ran his own business, had built it from almost nothing over the course of his adult life, and he was genuinely proud of what he'd created. He wasn't flashy about it. He didn't talk about money constantly or act like it made him better than anyone. He just quietly did the work, day after day, and the results spoke for themselves. After my parents divorced, he still paid alimony and child support for every single month that he was legally required to. Not a dollar short, not a day late. The man kept a ledger, not because he was petty about it, but because he knew my mother would eventually claim he'd underpaid, and he wanted documentation. He was right. She claimed it. He produced the ledger. That was the end of that. When the legal obligation ended, it ended, and my mother's reaction to that was to threaten him, insult him, send 2 separate letters through 2 separate lawyers demanding he owed her more, and eventually show up at his office, his actual office, where he worked, where his employees were, and scream at him in the lobby that he owed her more money. He had her escorted out. He didn't press charges, but he did have the entire thing captured on the building's security cameras and filed away, because that's the kind of person he was. He didn't react. He documented. He also contributed $30,000 to my sister's college fund, which for a man who had no legal obligation to do anything beyond what the court ordered, I think says a lot about his character. He did it because he thought it was the right thing to do, not because anyone made him, not because he expected anything in return. My mother, when she found out about this money, tried to get access to it under the claim that she should manage it as my sister's primary parent. My dad had set it up specifically so she couldn't. My mother was furious. My sister eventually used the money to attend a state school for 2.5 years before dropping out, which is a whole separate story that I'll touch on. Living with my dad was, in a word, different. It wasn't always easy. He wasn't the type to coddle me. He expected effort, follow through, and accountability, but it never felt punishing the way things at my mother's house did. It felt fair. There's a difference between hard and unfair, and my dad understood that distinction with great precision. When I made mistakes, we talked about them. When I did something well, he acknowledged it. When I was struggling, he'd sit across from me at the kitchen table and ask questions until we figured out what was wrong, never assuming he knew the answer before he heard me out. And when I was 16 years old, he started teaching me his business. I want to be clear that this wasn't some kind of formal apprenticeship or anything like that. It started small. He'd bring me along to meetings sometimes and just have me sit and observe. He'd explain things to me in the evenings over dinner. He'd ask me what I thought about a decision he was considering, not because he needed my input, but because he wanted me to develop the habit of thinking through problems out loud. Say you're thinking. He used to tell me, don't just think it, say it. That's how you find the holes. I still hear that in my head when I'm working through something complicated. Over the years, that grew into actual responsibility, real tasks, real stakes, real consequences when things didn't go right. And I got good at it, not because I'm some kind of prodigy, but because I put in the hours and paid attention and genuinely cared about what we were building. There's something that happens when the work you're doing matters to someone you love. It stops feeling like work. By the time I was in my late 20s, I wasn't just working for my dad's company. I was a genuine contributor to its success. And about a year before everything I'm about to tell you happened, he made me a partner, not out of nepotism, or at least not only out of that. The other people in that business, the ones who'd been there for years and who had no personal relationship with my dad, they respected the work I'd done. That mattered to me more than the title. Things were genuinely good. I had the career. I had a good relationship with my girlfriend, who I'll call Jess because she deserves to be a real character in this story and not just my girlfriend. I had a home I was proud of and a future I felt good about. And then, about 8 months before the events I'm going to describe, my dad got sick. He'd been a heavy smoker for most of his life. He'd cut back over the years but never fully quit, and the damage was done. His immune system was compromised in ways that weren't always obvious from the outside, because he never liked to make a big deal of his health. He was the kind of man who went to every doctor's appointment and then came home and didn't discuss what was said unless he had to. He caught COVID-19 during a period when he was already dealing with some other complications, and he didn't recover. He was 60 years old. That's it, 60 years old. And he was gone. I'm not going to dwell on the grief here because that's not really what this story is about. And also because I don't think I've fully processed it yet if I'm being honest. Losing him was the worst thing that's ever happened to me. He was my person. The parent who showed up, who stayed, who taught me things I use every single day. And I miss him every single day. But the point is, he died. And that set everything else in motion. Part 2. The funeral, the will, and the first warning signs. Because of pandemic restrictions at the time, my dad's funeral was socially distanced and held partially over video call, which was surreal and sad in a way that's hard to describe. He was cremated per his own wishes and buried in a local cemetery, so there was no casket, no open viewing, none of the rituals that normally help people process grief. Just a small gathering in a weird, fractured, half-digital format that felt inadequate for the kind of man he was. His business partners called in from 3 different states. Some of his oldest friends stood 6 feet apart in a cemetery in late afternoon light with masks on. It was one of the loneliest things I've ever been part of. This was also the first time I'd seen my mother and sister in years. We'd been pretty much no contact for a long time, by choice on my part. After I moved in with my dad, the relationship with my mother deteriorated slowly but steadily until, by my mid-20s, it had effectively ended. Not with a dramatic confrontation, not with a formal declaration, just with silence, and a gradual reduction in occasions where I had to be in the same room as someone who made me feel like furniture. I had communicated via text on major holidays, out of some residual sense of obligation, and I'd attended my sister's college graduation before she dropped out. But that was essentially the extent of it. There's only so many times someone can treat you like a servant before you start limiting access to yourself. My mother's demeanor at the funeral was, to put it charitably, indifferent. She wasn't crying. She wasn't visibly upset. She looked like someone waiting for a bus, which, again, wasn't exactly a shock given that the last interaction she'd had with my dad in person was the screaming lobby incident, and the last interaction before that had been through lawyers. She'd been trying to convince people for years that my dad had hidden assets during the divorce and that she'd been cheated out of what was rightfully hers. This was not true. My dad was many things, but he wasn't sneaky with money. He was straightforward about everything, including the divorce settlement, which had been handled by a mediator both parties agreed to. What my mother was at that funeral, more than anything else, was watchful. She kept looking around, noting things. I caught her making eye contact with my dad's lawyer, our family friend I'll call Marcus, in a way that was almost evaluating, like she was already calculating. I filed that observation away. My sister seemed more genuinely emotional, which I'll give her, though even then there was something about it that I couldn't quite shake. The crying was real, but the way she positioned herself, the way she made sure people noticed her crying, had a performance quality to it that I recognized from childhood. But maybe I was being uncharitable given everything. Grief is strange and it makes people strange. I'm aware I'm not a neutral observer here. After the funeral, I found out some things I hadn't known. One of them was that my sister had gotten pregnant sometime before the pandemic and had suffered a traumatic miscarriage. No one had told me. And look, I get it. We were practically no contact. I'm not saying they were obligated to inform me, but hearing about it after the fact, at a funeral, from my sister's friend who assumed I already knew, was a strange experience. I felt something real for my sister in that moment. Genuine sympathy. A miscarriage is devastating and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But here's the thing about emotions and context. Sympathy is a real thing, and it didn't stop being real later. But it also didn't obligate me to do anything. And it certainly wasn't a blank check. I want to make that clear now because it becomes relevant, very relevant. A few weeks after the funeral, my dad's will was read. He'd clearly planned ahead, because there was even a pre-recorded video message that was played as part of the process. He'd recorded it about a year before he died, apparently, which means he'd known he was running out of time and had decided to spend some of that time making sure the people he loved heard from him one more time. He joked in it about his smoking. Said something like, if this doesn't get me eventually, something else will, which was so quintessentially him that I had to take a minute before I could keep listening. He addressed me directly in the video. He talked about watching me grow up and grow into someone he was proud of. He talked about the business and what he hoped I'd do with it. He said, specifically, that he wasn't leaving me the house as a financial asset. He was leaving it to me because it was where we'd lived, where we'd built things together. And he wanted me to have it because he knew I'd take care of it the way he had. He said it like an assignment, like he was handing me something he trusted me with. I was left almost everything. His business, most of his liquid assets, and his home. The house where I had grown up with him after the divorce. The house that we had worked on together over the years. The house that already felt more like mine than anywhere else I'd ever lived. He left my sister his 2015 Nissan Altima and around $10,000 in cash. He left my mother $1,000 and a handful of personal items she'd been claiming were rightfully hers since the divorce. Items that Marcus had spent some time verifying actually had been hers before the marriage. $1,000 and her own stuff back for a woman who had spent years insisting my father owed her more, always more. I'll admit I had a moment. Marcus, reading that portion of the will, kept his face professionally neutral. But I know him well enough to have seen the slight tension in his jaw that meant he was also having a moment. I could see, even before the fallout started, that this wasn't going to go over well. My mother's reaction in the room was controlled in a way that felt dangerous, like a pressure cooker that hasn't started hissing yet. She said very little. She accepted the items without making a scene, and she looked, once, at me. Not at my sister, not at Marcus, not at the table, directly at me. And she smiled the way a person smiles when they've just decided something. I noted that too. My sister's reaction was more immediate. She was upset, visibly so. in a way that escalated quickly from disappointment to something that looked a lot like outrage. She made some comments about how it wasn't fair, how she'd expected more, how she'd always assumed certain things would come to her. I tried to be gentle with her. I reminded her that our dad had contributed significantly to her education fund, had given her a reliable car, had left her a meaningful amount of cash. She said he barely knew her. She said he'd chosen me over her whole life. She said she'd been abandoned. She was crying by the end, and it was the kind of crying that's hard to watch even when you're angry, because whatever else she is, she's still my sister, and whatever else he was to her, he was still her father. Eventually the conversation ended without resolution. I let a few weeks go by. I moved into the house officially, and Jess moved in with me. We settled in. We started making plans. Life, somehow, started to feel like it might be okay again, even in the shadow of losing my dad. I repainted the back bedroom. I organized his study. I started going through things slowly, the way you have to when you're not ready to go through things fast. And then they showed up at my door. Part 3. The visit. I want to describe this in detail because I think the details are important for understanding exactly what kind of entitlement we're dealing with here. This wasn't a confused misunderstanding. This wasn't someone showing up with a strange request that could be chalked up to grief or stress. This was calculated, planned, executed with a level of audacity that still makes my jaw drop when I think about it. It was a Tuesday evening. I remember the day because Jess and I had just finished a late dinner and were watching something on TV. One of those low-stakes cooking competition shows that require zero emotional investment and are perfect for the end of a long week. Regular night in. No reason to expect anything. And then there was a knock at the door. Unexpected. No prior call or message. Nothing. Just a knock. I answered it and there they were. My mother and my sister, standing on my porch. My mother was dressed like she was going somewhere nice. Not funeral nice, but definitely not. I just happened to be in the neighborhood nice. She had done her hair. She had a tote bag over one arm. She had the look. I want to describe the look again, in more detail this time, because I think it matters. My mother has a specific expression she uses when she believes she holds all the cards. It's composed, self-satisfied, with a slight forward tilt of the chin that communicates that she's already run the calculation and she likes how it comes out. She had that look, the look of someone who has a plan and is pleased with herself for having it. My sister was almost giddy, practically bouncing. I starting around trying to see inside the house, neck craning toward the hallway. She was wearing a shirt that had been clearly chosen to make her pregnancy visible. She was maybe 4.5 months at this point, enough of a bump to be obvious. Not so much that movement was affected. The shirt made it the first thing you noticed. I said something like, "Hey, what are you two doing here?" Friendly enough, cautious. Neither of them really answered. My mother sort of gestured and walked in. My sister followed, and they just made themselves at home in my living room like they'd been invited, which they had not. My mother sat down on my sofa, in my house, like she owned it. My sister immediately started wandering off down the hallway, opening doors, peeking into rooms. Jess came in from the kitchen and stopped when she saw them. I watched her do the split-second calculation that every perceptive person does when they walk into a situation that is clearly not what it's supposed to be. She adjusted her expression and said a polite hello. My mother snapped her fingers at Jess, not at me, at Jess, my girlfriend, in our home, who my mother had met twice in her life. She snapped her fingers and said she wanted a cold bottled water, like a woman summoning a waitress at a restaurant she doesn't think much of. Jess, who is a better person than I am in the specific way that she doesn't give people the reaction they're looking for, said sure in a perfectly pleasant tone and went to get it. Capital I caught her face on the way out of the room. She had already gone somewhere internally, where she was very calm and very focused, which is what Jess does when something is really wrong. I have learned to pay attention to that face. From down the hallway, my sister's voice, "Mommy, it's perfect." "Yes, Mommy." She is 28 years old. My mother settled back on the couch with the air of someone who had arrived home after a long trip. She accepted the water from Jess. She didn't say thank you. She took a sip. She set it down. And then she looked at me. "Well," she said, "I think it's time you did your brotherly duty." I asked her what she meant, and then she said it. She told me that since my father had passed, the house should rightfully have gone to her, because she had been his only spouse. She acknowledged that it had gone to me instead, but said that I could fix this, because I made good money and could simply buy a new place to live. And if I was so determined to stay, she generously and she said generously, offered that I could keep one room for myself and cover the bills until I was ready to move out permanently, at which point they would take full possession. One room in the house my father left me while I paid the bills. She said this with the tone of someone announcing a settlement she had thought deeply about and found more than fair, like she expected me to be grateful. I stood there for a moment. There was a split second where the sheer scale of what she'd just said hadn't fully computed. Like when you read a sentence twice because you can't believe what it says. And then it clicked, and I felt something shift in me. Not panic, not anxiety, clarity. The specific, sharpening kind of clarity that comes when you realize you've been here before. You know what this is, and you know exactly what happens if you don't stop it right now. Jess and I had both spent enough time on the internet reading stories exactly like this one to know precisely what happens if you let it get a foothold. You don't negotiate, you don't explain, you don't try to appeal to reason, because reason isn't what's happening here. You draw the line immediately and you hold it. So I took a breath, and I drew it. I told them in clear and direct terms, with some language I won't fully reproduce here, but which you can probably reconstruct, that what my mother was describing was not going to happen, that she didn't get to order me around, especially not in my own home, that my father had worked hard for everything he built and had left it to me legally and deliberately, and that wasn't something she got to override by showing up unannounced with a plan. She told me she was my mother, that she had brought me into this world, and that as far as I was concerned, she was God. She said when she says jump, my response should be to ask how high. She used those words out loud in my house, and then she officially informed me, as though this were a legally binding eviction notice, that I had 2 weeks to pack my bags and transfer the deed to her. She said this graciously. She used the word gracious to describe giving me 2 weeks to vacate the home that my dead father had deliberately, lovingly, on video, left to me. I picked up my phone and started dialing. Part 4. The confrontation. She came off the couch when she saw me dialing, asked what I was doing. I told her I was calling the police to remove her from my home. What followed is a sequence of events I've replayed in my head many times since, and every time I replay it I arrive at the same conclusion. I handled it the way I needed to handle it. This is what happened. My mother moved toward me and knocked my phone out of my hands. Then she tried to stomp on it. I managed to grab it before her foot landed. I told her that if she didn't leave I would physically remove her myself. And I said it in the flat, no performance voice that my dad had modeled for me my whole life. The voice that means the words are exactly what they are. Nothing more and nothing less. My mother slapped me across the face. If you've grown up with someone who uses physical force as a tool of control, you develop a calibration for when a line has been crossed in a way that changes the rules of the interaction. She had crossed it. I hit her back, harder, backhanded, hard enough that she sat back down on the couch. She held her hand to her face, composure gone, looking at me like I was the one who'd started it. How dare you? She said. I picked up my phone and told her again I was calling the police. My sister came running in from the hallway, arms out, putting herself between us, saying I should do the right thing for once in my life and be a good big brother. And I don't know exactly what happened in that moment except that something I'd been sitting on for a very long time came out all at once. I told her I wasn't the bad sibling. I reminded her of who had done the chores for years while she sat in her room. I reminded her that she had stolen $60 from me when I was 13, and a lot of other money after that, from my room, from my wallet, from whatever I'd left accessible, money I had actually worked for, that she had helped herself to without consequence because my mother's response was always to tell me to be more generous. Capital I told her she was a mooch and a thief and I didn't owe her anything. And I meant it, not purely in a cruel way, in the way you mean things when you have been carrying them for too long and you finally just set them down in the open. My sister started crying. My mother did the thing she always does when my sister cries. Immediately gathered her and held her and directed all available hostility at whoever caused the tears. She glared at me over my sister's shoulder like I was a monster for having said true things out loud. And then she tried to be smart about it. She told me that if I called the police, she would simply tell them I had hit her, that she might even say I had threatened a pregnant woman. She trailed the sentence off like she expected me to fill the gap with fear. I held up a hand and stopped her. I told her to look at Jess, who had quietly gotten her phone out at some point very early in this visit. She told me later it was right after the finger snap. and had been recording. I told my mother that we had video evidence of her assaulting me first. We had her on camera openly stating her intention to make false reports to police. And we had all of this while she was standing in my home demanding I hand over my legally inherited property and describing herself as God. I said I didn't think that would be so good for her at her job, with her Airbnb guests, with her sister, who happened to be the person in the extended family who had the most publicly expressed doubts about my mother's character over the years and who, I knew, would absolutely believe every second of that footage. I watched the air go out of her. It's a specific thing, watching someone realize their leverage doesn't exist. She'd mapped the whole conversation out, every move, every counter, every angle. And Jess had just quietly made all of it irrelevant with the phone she'd been holding for 45 minutes. My mother grabbed my sister's arm and started pulling her toward the door. And then my sister refused to leave. She pulled free from my mother's grip, walked to the front porch, sat down on the steps, grabbed the handrail with both hands, and began screaming, "You promised me," over and over, sitting on my porch steps, both hands white-knuckled on the railing, screaming that she had been promised the house. She was 28 years old and the mother of a child she was currently carrying. I stood in my doorway and I watched. I actually laughed, not meanly, or not only meanly. There was something about the sheer theatrical absurdity of the scene that bypassed every other available emotion and went straight to laughter. It took several minutes. My mother, trying to peel my sister off the railing, alternating between hissing at her to get up and throwing furious looks back at me. My sister continuing to scream. Our neighbors, I would later learn, witnessed some portion of this from their windows. One of them, a retired gentleman named Frank who has lived next door for 20 years and who I have a warm but mostly waved at relationship with, told me about it a few days later with an expression that walked the line between concern and barely concealed amusement. Eventually my mother got my sister upright and into the car. She gave me a final look at the end of the driveway, the look that's supposed to say this isn't over, and then she drove away. I stood on my porch for a minute in the quiet. Then I went inside, sat down on my sofa, and looked at Jess. "You got all of that?" I said. She turned her phone around and showed me the recording. Crisp, continuous, time-stamped, all of it, she said. We sat there for a moment. She called herself God. Jess said, "I know. In your house." "I know." "Okay," said Jess. And she went to the kitchen to make tea. Part 5. The social media campaign. I thought it was over. I genuinely did. And I want to acknowledge that this was naive of me, because I know who my mother is. Letting things go is not in her vocabulary. It never has been. She is the kind of person who will wait years to settle a score, who keeps a private ledger of perceived grievances, and who believes, truly believes, that the narrative she tells about herself is the only one that exists. A few days later, Jess told me something was happening on Facebook. I tried to look, but I'd been blocked by both my mother and my sister. Blocked before the posts even went up, which meant they'd pre-planned it. They'd written their versions of events, scheduled the blocking, and then posted, cutting off my ability to see or respond before I even knew it was happening. But they'd forgotten about Jess. Not blocked, not even thought about, which tells you a lot about how much they regard the women in my life as actual people versus accessories to my existence. Jess was able to see everything, and she screenshotted all of it. What they'd posted was a coordinated smear campaign across multiple posts, on multiple timelines, tagged to multiple mutual connections. My mother had framed me as a greedy, manipulative person who had essentially stolen my sister's inheritance by corrupting the lawyer who handled my father's will. The implication, not stated outright, but absolutely clear to anyone reading, was that Marcus had been bribed, that the will had been altered or fabricated, and that my father had never actually intended for things to work out the way they did. My sister's posts were more emotional, more personal. She wrote about feeling abandoned by a father who had always favored me, about losing a pregnancy and then losing an inheritance and then being screamed at in my house when she came to ask for help. There was no mention of the finger snapping, or the demand that I hand over the deed in 2 weeks, or the part where my mother declared herself God, or the physical assault, or the threat to lie to police. Just a story about a grieving pregnant woman being turned away by a cold, greedy brother. The posts got traction, mostly with people from my mother's side of the family, people who had always been in her orbit and inclined to believe her by default. Some of them sent me messages I won't repeat in full but which were not kind. Some were confused. Some were angry. Some asked questions that made it clear they'd taken everything at face value. Nobody from my dad's side believed any of it. Not one person. A few of them posted publicly saying as much. which I appreciated more than I can say. His oldest business partner, a man who had known my dad for 30 years and who had been at the funeral via video call from 3 states away, posted a comment on my mother's post that said, simply, "I knew this man for 3 decades. This is not true." My mother deleted the comment. He posted it again. She deleted it again. He posted it a 3rd time and tagged several other people who had known my dad. She gave up and left it. I called Marcus. He was, to put it mildly, not pleased to be implicated in a bribery scheme by people who had been present at the will reading and had received their legal portions without objection. He is a meticulous, careful man who has practiced law for 30 years, and the idea that his professional reputation was being casually dragged through Facebook by 2 women with a grudge was, I'll use his word, unacceptable. I brought him everything: the screenshots, the printed posts, the video. He watched the video twice. He said, "She told you she was God." "Yes." "In your house." "That she was demanding you vacate." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'm going to enjoy writing this letter." Part 6. The letter, and what came after. The cease and desist letter that Marcus wrote was, by his own modest assessment, quite good. It was civil. It was precise. It was legally airtight. It named every false claim that had been made, cited the specific posts, included timestamps, and made it very clear that the individuals in question had made these statements with full knowledge of the facts, having been present at the will reading, and that continuing to make them would constitute defamation. It also, and this was the part I had specifically requested, made clear what the alternative looked like. Not just legal action. Specifically, the video would be shared with the same audience they'd lied to, with their employers, with the platforms that hosted my mother's Airbnb listings, which, for those who don't know, take a fairly dim view of hosts who assault people, threaten to make false police reports, and attempt to fraudulently seize property. There was also one piece of information in that letter that I had specifically asked Marcus to include, because I had looked into it and confirmed it was relevant. My mother had not, as it turned out, accurately represented her property on her Airbnb listing. There were some discrepancies between what guests were told to expect and what the actual legal occupancy permits allowed. I had learned this from a very brief and illuminating conversation with the county clerk's office, where public records are, as they always are, public. The letter did not threaten to report this. It simply noted that Marcus was aware of various matters that might be of interest to relevant platforms and authorities, and that his client was prepared to move in multiple directions simultaneously if the situation was not resolved. The letter went out by express mail, signed for. My mother called the same day it arrived. Part 7. The phone call. I've had a lot of difficult phone calls in my life. This one was in the top 5. But for reasons I didn't entirely expect. She was furious. The controlled kind of furious that sounds like calm if you don't know what you're listening for. But I've known her my whole life and I could hear every layer of it. She called me unreasonable, vindictive. She said she had only done what she did because she was worried about my sister. Because my sister was pregnant and struggling and needed stability. And wasn't I capable of any compassion at all? I let her finish. And then I said a few things very clearly. I said I didn't care about her justifications. I said I was not interested in her explanation for why she thought it was acceptable to show up at my home, demand my property, physically assault me, and then lie about it publicly. The why was irrelevant to me. The only thing I was interested in was whether she was going to correct the record or whether I was going to do it for her. She went into another round about my sister, about the baby, about what kind of person I was for not helping family. I said, "She's living in your house. You have multiple bedrooms. You have space. If you want to help her, help her. That is not my responsibility and it was never my responsibility. What you actually want is to use my sister's pregnancy as the reason why I should give you a house. And that's not going to happen." Silence. A long silence. Then, "Fine, you win. Have it your way and keep the effing house." And she hung up. That evening, the posts came down. Both of them. The comments they generated. The tags. The threads. All of it. I was unblocked, and a new post went up from my mother's account. It was what I'd call a strategically minimized acknowledgement. She had acted out of emotion and jumped the gun. The house was legally mine per the will. She regretted the distress the situation had caused. No mention of the slap. No mention of the threat to lie to police. No mention of God. But the core facts were there, stated to the same audience she'd lied to. And that was what mattered. My sister's post was nearly identical in wording, which told me she hadn't written it. She added a line about pregnancy hormones, which I choose to find funny rather than infuriating because the alternative requires more energy than I have. The family response was a mix. Some people apologized. The ones who'd sent the angriest messages were sheepish, as they should have been, though I'm less interested in forgiving them than I probably should be for someone who claims the moral high ground. But the apologies came, and what was useful about all of it was that it showed me very clearly, with a precision I appreciated, who in that extended family had reached for the pitchfork fastest. When my mother pointed, "Good to know, useful information," filed away. Part 8. The part 1 hadn't told before. Here's where the new material comes in. The part I held back in earlier versions because it was still playing out, and because I wanted to see how it ended before I described it. About 3 weeks after the cease and desist, my mother's Airbnb listings went dark. Both of them. The rooms she rented, which generated meaningful monthly income, just disappeared from the platform. I don't know exactly what caused it. I didn't report her to the platform. Marcus didn't contact the platform. We had noted in the letter only that we were aware of various matters. Someone, somewhere, apparently decided to do some independent research, or possibly a guest had a complaint that had been sitting in a queue, or possibly the platform did a periodic audit. I genuinely don't know. What I know is that the listings went dark and my mother called Jess, not me, Jess, in a panic asking if I had reported her. Jess, who is remarkably good at being innocently unhelpful when the situation calls for it, said she wasn't sure what my mother was talking about and suggested she contact the platform directly to sort it out. I was in the next room during this phone call. Jess had it on speaker. The listings eventually came back, but it took 6 weeks. And during that 6 weeks my mother lost income she had apparently been depending on more than she let on. I know this because my sister, who at this point had been relocated to the basement, began posting on social media about how the household finances were stressed and how unfair it was that she was being asked to contribute to groceries when she was pregnant. I am going to say something now that might surprise you. I felt bad about the Airbnb thing, not because my mother didn't deserve consequences, but because whatever caused that review was probably triggered by our letter, even indirectly. And I hadn't intended it as an escalation. I had held it in reserve. It had deployed anyway. I sat with that for a few days. Then I remembered the finger snap, and that she called herself God, and the slap, and I stopped feeling bad. Around this same time, I got a letter, not from my mother, from my sister, handwritten, which surprised me because my sister communicates almost exclusively via phone screen. So a handwritten letter felt significant. It was 2 pages. She apologized for her part in what happened. She said she'd known, even at the time, that it had gone too far. She said the pregnancy had made her desperate in a way she wasn't proud of, and that she'd let our mother led her into something she shouldn't have gone along with. She asked if there was any possibility of rebuilding something between us, even just something small, for the sake of the baby. She did not ask for the house. She did not ask for money. She did not ask for anything. I read that letter 4 times. I haven't responded yet. I'm not sure what I'm going to do. Part of me wants to believe it as genuine. Part of me has enough scar tissue from this particular family to know that hope is a resource to be spent carefully. I've kept the letter. I'm thinking about it. That's all I can say right now. Part 9. A few things I want to say directly. For those of you who have gotten this far, I want to address a few things I suspect are on some people's minds. First, the slap. Yes, I hit my mother back. I've seen how this part of the story plays in different audiences and I understand it's complicated. I'm not going to pretend it was my most controlled moment, but I want to be clear. She hit me first, in my own home, after barging in uninvited, after physically assaulting my phone, and after demanding I surrender my legally inherited property. I'm a grown adult and I responded to being struck by striking back. I'm not apologizing for that. I notice that nobody in this story has asked my mother to apologize for the slap. The asymmetry of that is noted. Second, the brotherly duty thing. The idea that I have some obligation to sacrifice my home and financial security because my sister is pregnant is one I reject entirely. My sister's pregnancy is something that happened to my sister and her boyfriend. It is their situation. It is their responsibility. A biological relationship is not a mechanism for extracting property from people who actually worked for it. I love my sister in the complicated, exhausted, residual way that you love someone who is family and who has also stolen from you for 20 years. That love does not include a deed transfer. Third, my dad's will was fair, more than fair. He left my sister a car, $10,000 in cash, and had contributed $30,000 to her education fund. She received less than me because I had built a genuine professional relationship with him and his business, had worked for it for over a decade, and because he knew who his children were and made his decisions accordingly. That is his right. That was his life's work. If my sister's argument is that the will was unfair, her argument is with the choices she made about her own relationship with our father, and those are not choices I made for her. Fourth, why I didn't offer anything. I know some of you are thinking it, that she's pregnant and struggling and maybe I should have offered something, some small gesture. Capital I want to be honest about why I didn't, because I have learned from extensive, documented, lived experience that with my mother and sister, any concession is treated as an opening. Any gesture of goodwill becomes the floor of the next demand, not the ceiling. The moment I offer something, it's evidence that I should have offered more and chose not to out of selfishness. That's not a dynamic I'm willing to step back into. Not after everything. Part 10. Where things stand now. It's been about 2 months since the night they showed up at my door. Here's where things are. My mother and sister are both living in my mother's house. My sister is in the basement. Her boyfriend is there too. By all social media accounts, it is not a harmonious arrangement. My sister posts regularly about space, about fairness, about how the main house has rooms sitting empty that could be hers. My mother apparently does not agree. There is a certain poetry in watching my mother and sister, having failed to extract anything from me, now directing their considerable energies at extracting things from each other. The Airbnb listings are back up. I monitor them occasionally, not obsessively, just occasionally. Jess says this is petty and she's right and I do it anyway. I have had no direct contact with my mother since the phone call. She has not reached out. Capital I have not reached out. I am at peace with this. Actually at peace. Not performing peace. My sister's letter is on my desk. Still thinking about it. Jess and I are doing well. Better than well. She was, through all of this, exactly the person I needed her to be. Calm, sharp, quick thinking, and she had the presence of mind to start recording almost from the moment my mother sat down on my sofa. If she hadn't done that, this story has a completely different ending. She is aware of this. I have told her I am aware of this. We leave it at that, because she doesn't need me to make a speech about it. I'm still at the company. It's still going well. I am still missing my dad every single day and I expect I will be for a long time. But I am in the house he built, doing the work he taught me, and living a life that I think he would recognize as mine. When I sit in his study, surrounded by his books and his files and the things he left behind, I feel him in the way you feel someone who shaped you, not as a presence, exactly, but as a residue. The way of thinking he left in me. The voice that says, document everything, hold your ground, and don't let anyone rattle you, not even someone who claims to be God. One last thing. Yes, there are more developments. I mentioned there would be an update, and there will be. This post is already something of a small novel, so I'll save the next chapter for its own space. It involves my sister's boyfriend, a conversation I had with Frank, the neighbor, and a development with Marcus that I did not see coming and which gave me more satisfaction than I am probably allowed to feel about something that is, in the end, just paperwork. Stay tuned. TLDR. My mother and sister showed up unannounced at my home and demanded I hand it over to my pregnant sister because my mother had decided she was God and the house was rightfully hers. My girlfriend recorded the entire confrontation, including my mother hitting me and threatening to lie to police. I called their bluff, got a lawyer involved, and made them publicly retract every lie they'd put on social media. A sequence of additional events involving Airbnb listings, a cease and desist letter, and some public records. Research followed. My sister wrote me a handwritten apology letter that I am still thinking about. My mother's rental income took an unplanned 6-week hit. My house is still my house. We good. Edit. Thank you all for the awards and the kind words. I'm genuinely overwhelmed by the response. We'll post the update when I've had a chance to write it all out.